There's a specific kind of pressure that arrives before anyone is watching, before the cameras find their angles, before the arena fills, before the noise becomes something you can feel in your chest. It lives in the quiet moments of a pre-dawn gym, in the hour before a bus departs for a road game, in the space between what a player knows about herself and what the world has not yet decided to believe. Caitlin Clark carried that pressure into the WNBA, not as a burden, but as something closer to fuel, a compressed understanding that everything she had built across 4 years in Iowa was now about to be tested against a different standard, in a different league, against women who had been professionals, while she was still learning what professional truly meant. The transition from college to the pros is never clean for anyone. But Clark's version of that transition arrived wrapped in a level of public expectation that had no real precedent in women's basketball. Fans who had never watched a WNBA game in their lives were buying Indiana Fever tickets specifically to see her play. That is not a welcome. That is a weight. What made that weight unusual was its source. It didn't come from doubt. There was plenty of skepticism in certain corners. But that wasn't the thing pressing down hardest. It came from the sheer size of what people believed was possible, and the knowledge that belief of that scale can collapse into disappointment faster than it builds into something lasting. Clark had broken every viewership record women's college basketball had ever produced. She had filled arenas in a way that forced television networks to reconsider how they scheduled and promoted women's games entirely. And she had done all of that inside a system, college basketball, that, for all its intensity, operates with guardrails that professional sports do not provide. The WNBA she was entering in 2024 was a league with real history, real talent, real competitive pride, and a governance structure that had spent decades managing scarcity rather than abundance. She was arriving as something the league's existing architecture had never been designed to accommodate, not a promising rookie, not a marketable face to attach to a struggling franchise, but a genuine structural disruption in human form. The silence before her first professional season wasn't empty. It was full of everything that was about to change. Ames. Iowa is not where basketball legends are supposed to come from. The sport has its traditional pipelines, the playgrounds of New York, the AAU circuits of Georgia and Texas, the prep schools of New England that have been manufacturing Division I prospects for generations. Iowa sits outside all of those gravitational fields, and that distance shaped Caitlin Clark in ways that a more conventional basketball upbringing almost certainly would not have. She grew up in a household where competition was not performed for an audience. It was simply the operating language of daily life. Her brothers were her first opponents, and they were not interested in going easy on her. That early environment built something specific, not just toughness, though that came too, but a particular kind of unsentimental relationship with losing. You lose, you figure out why, you come back tomorrow with something you didn't have yesterday. There are no shortcuts in that education, and there are no moments where someone pulls you aside and tells you the standard is being lowered because of your age or your size, or the gap between where you are and where the best players already stand. Clark absorbed that framework before she was old enough to articulate it, and it became the invisible architecture underneath everything that followed. What separated her development from that of most elite prospects was not raw talent alone. The WNBA is full of players who were the most talented person in every gym they ever entered before turning professional. What separated Clark was the nature of her ambition, which was never really about recognition. It was about solving the game. From her earliest years with a basketball, she was drawn not to the moments that drew applause, but to the moments that required thinking, the skip pass that opened a corner, 3, the hesitation dribble that froze a help defender half a step too long, the angle of approach to a pick and roll that determined whether the shot was contested or clean. Her shooting range, which would eventually become the most discussed aspect of her game, was not a party trick developed for highlight reels. It was a logical extension of a basketball mind that understood spacing at a level most players only begin to grasp in their mid-20s. She grasped it as a teenager, refined it through 4 years under Lisa Bluter at Iowa, and arrived in Indianapolis. Not as a player still becoming herself, but as a player who already knew precisely what she was and was prepared to prove it against the best competition the sport had to offer. The WNBA that Caitlin Clark entered in the spring of 2024 was a league in a particular kind of transition, not crisis, not collapse, but the slow and complicated process of an institution trying to modernize faster than its existing structures naturally allowed. Founded in 1996 as a summer complement to the NBA calendar, the league had spent nearly 3 decades operating on a financial model built around scarcity. modest broadcast deals, moderate arena capacities, salary structures that sent many of its best players overseas every offseason just to earn something approaching a living wage. These were not failures of vision, so much as reflections of a marketplace that had never fully committed to valuing women's professional basketball on its own terms. The league had survived that environment through a combination of genuine competitive excellence, loyal core fan bases in cities like Seattle, Los Angeles, and Connecticut, and a rotating cast of transcendent players, from Lisa Leslie to Diana Taurasi to Sue Bird to Brianna Stewart, who kept the sports standard high even when the infrastructure surrounding it lagged behind what their talent deserved. The WNBA endured because the players inside it were extraordinary, but endurance and transformation are different things. And by 2023, the league was still waiting for the external force that would make transformation unavoidable. What Clark walked into was also a league with a specific governance culture, one shaped by years of managing limited resources, navigating complex relationships with NBA ownership groups, and making institutional decisions inside a system where the margin for error was always narrow. Kathy Engelbert had taken over as commissioner in 2019, arriving from a corporate background that prioritized risk management, brand consistency, and the kind of steady, incremental growth that keeps stakeholders comfortable. That approach had genuine merit in a league that couldn't afford instability, but it also produced a particular institutional reflex, the tendency to distribute credit broadly, to frame every development as a collective achievement, and to resist allowing any single variable to become so central to the league's identity that its absence would constitute a crisis. That reflex was not malicious. It was the product of an organization that had spent decades learning to survive without stars, who crossed over into genuine mainstream cultural relevance. The problem was that Clark represented exactly that kind of crossover, and the institutional muscle memory built for scarcity was not designed to handle what abundance actually looked like when it finally arrived. The easiest thing to say about Caitlin Clark's basketball game is that she can shoot from anywhere. It is also the least useful thing to say because it reduces a profoundly intelligent system of play to its most visually spectacular component and leaves everything that makes that component possible sitting unexamined underneath the surface. Clark's shooting range is real, and it is historic. She was hitting shots from distances that most professional players treat as territory that simply doesn't belong to them. But the range only works because of what precedes it. Before the shot comes the read, and before the read comes the positioning, and before the positioning comes an understanding of defensive tendencies that Clark had developed into something approaching a science by the time she arrived in Indianapolis. She didn't shoot from 40 feet because she was gambling. She shot from 40 feet because she had already calculated, in real time, that the defense had made a specific error in its coverage rotation and that the window available to her was cleaner from that distance than any closer option the possession might produce. That is not athleticism. That is basketball intelligence operating at a speed that makes it look like instinct when it is actually something far more deliberate. Her passing was where that intelligence became most visible to anyone watching closely enough to look past the scoring totals. Clark finished her rookie WNBA season with 337 assists, a single-season record for the league, and that number requires some unpacking to appreciate properly. Assists in basketball are partially a function of talent and partially a function of something harder to quantify: the willingness to involve others at moments when a lesser player would default to their own shot. Clark's assist numbers reflected a player who understood that her gravity, the defensive attention she commanded simply by existing on the court, was itself a resource that could be spent on behalf of her teammates. Every time a defense collapsed, two defenders in her direction, she had already identified which teammate that decision had left open and where the ball needed to go to make the defense pay for its choice. She was not just reading the court. She was reading the court one decision ahead of the defense, which is the difference between a good point guard and a transformative one. The Indiana Fever's offensive system, such as it was in her first season, was rebuilt in real time around the possibilities her presence created, not just for her, but for every player sharing the floor with her. There is a particular kind of frustration that doesn't express itself as anger. It expresses itself as documentation. Stephanie White had been around professional basketball long enough to know the difference between a bad night of officiating and a pattern, and what she was watching across the early weeks of Clark's rookie season had stopped feeling like the former and started feeling unmistakably like the latter. hard contact that went uncalled, drives to the basket that ended on the floor without a whistle. A physical style of defense applied specifically and repeatedly to one player that referees seemed to collectively decide did not meet whatever internal threshold separated a foul from a basketball play. White didn't go to the press immediately. Coaches rarely do, because the professional calculation around public criticism of officiating is complicated, and the short-term cost is usually a technical foul and a fine. But she was counting every differential, every sequence, every moment where the standard applied to Clark visibly diverged from the standard applied to everyone else on the court. White was building a record, and records have a way of becoming impossible to dismiss when the numbers inside them grow large enough. The -31 free throw discrepancy that White eventually cited publicly was not a number anyone produced by cherry-picking a single bad game or a single hostile arena. It represented a sustained and measurable gap between the fouls Clark was absorbing and the fouls the officiating system was choosing to acknowledge across games, across opponents, across venues. When a coach presents a specific statistic like that to the press, she is not venting. She is filing. And the moment that number entered the public record, it changed the nature of every subsequent conversation about officiating in the league. One of the clearest single examples came during a 2024 playoff game against the Connecticut Sun, when Clark absorbed direct contact to the face visible, unambiguous, documented from multiple camera angles, and the officials decided that no foul had occurred. This was not a bang-bang play that unfolded too quickly for human perception to process accurately. It was the kind of contact that stops play in every other professional basketball context. Without debate, Clark got up, composed herself, and kept playing. She kept playing through all of it, through every uncalled foul, every hard landing, every sequence where the league's most watched player was held to a different physical standard than the rules on paper actually permitted. That combination, the documented pattern, the public record White was building, and Clark's own refusal to let any of it become an excuse, was quietly assembling the factual foundation that would eventually walk into a collective bargaining negotiation and demand something better. Every visible explosion in sports has an invisible infrastructure holding it up, and the infrastructure underneath Caitlin Clark's game is built from something that resists easy description because it is, at its core, simply repetition applied with uncommon intentionality over an uncommon number of years. The highlight packages capture the deep threes, and the no-look passes, and the moments where the crowd's reaction tells you something historic just happened. What they don't capture is the hour before shoot-around when the gym is empty, and Clark is working through the same footwork sequence she has worked through 10,000 times before, not because she has forgotten it, but because the difference between a shot that goes in and a shot that doesn't is often located in a half-inch of foot positioning that only stays reliable under pressure if the body has rehearsed it until the motion runs below the level of conscious thought. That kind of preparation does not announce itself. It simply shows up, invisibly, in the moments that matter most. When the game is close and the defense is smart, and the margin for imprecision has collapsed to almost nothing. What made Clark's preparation distinctive was not its volume alone. Elite players at every level put in extraordinary hours, and work ethic by itself does not separate the good from the transformative. What separated hers was its specificity. She was not a player who practiced in generalities. She studied defensive schemes with the focused attention of someone who understood that her game, built on spacing and range and the kind of floor vision that requires the defender's full respect at all times, only functioned at its highest level if she could anticipate what a defense was going to do before it did it. Film work for Clark was not a coaching obligation she fulfilled between more enjoyable activities. It was a natural extension of the same problem-solving instinct that had always made the game interesting to her. The question of why a defense makes the choices it makes, where its commitments create its vulnerabilities, and how those vulnerabilities could be found and exploited within the first few possessions of a game before the opposing coaching staff had time to adjust. She arrived at Indiana Fever practices not just physically prepared, but informationally prepared, carrying a level of opponent-specific knowledge that compressed the adjustment period most rookies require and allowed her to operate from almost the first week of her professional career. As though she had already played these games before, in some version, she had studied carefully enough to feel familiar. Lisa Bluter spent 4 years watching Caitlin Clark from closer than almost anyone else ever would. And what Bluter understood early enough to build an entire offensive system around it was that Clark's most valuable quality was not the one that drew the loudest reactions from the stand. The shooting was real, and the passing was real. But the thing underneath both of them, the quality that made everything else possible, was an almost preternatural composure, under conditions designed to produce the opposite. College basketball at the level Clark was operating Big Ten competition, national television, tournament pressure that compresses an entire season's worth of meaning into a single elimination game, generates a specific kind of psychological stress that reveals character in ways that controlled environments simply cannot replicate. Bluder didn't just coach Clark through that environment. She deliberately constructed situations within practice and within games that forced Clark to make decisions while uncomfortable, while tired, while the margin between success and failure had narrowed to the point where most players default to safety. Clark defaulted to clarity. That distinction, reinforced across 4 years of Bluder pushing the standard higher every time Clark met it, produced a player who arrived in the WNBA not needing to discover her composure under professional pressure because she had already been living inside a version of it for years. The relationships that shaped Clark extended beyond coaching into the texture of daily competition. The teammates who challenged her, the veterans in the WNBA who tested her immediately and without apology, and the rivals whose competitive intensity forced her to find levels she might not have accessed in a more comfortable environment. Aaliyah Boston's presence in Indiana was significant in ways that went beyond the box score contribution of a skilled interior player. Boston represented exactly the kind of established professional Clark needed beside her. Someone whose standards were already set at the highest level, whose daily habits around preparation and film and physical maintenance gave Clark a visible model of what sustained excellence inside a professional system actually required. The dynamic between them was never the story the outside world tried to make it, which was simply two talented players coexisting successfully. It was something more useful than that, a functional partnership between two different kinds of basketball intelligence that made each of them harder to defend and made the Fever, on their best nights, genuinely difficult to game plan against. The people around Clark didn't just support her development, they stress-tested it, continuously and without mercy, in the way that only genuine competition between people who respect each other can. The numbers that define Caitlin Clark's rookie season did not arrive as a single revelation. They accumulated across months of regular season basketball, building quietly inside box scores and broadcast ratings and ticket sales figures, until the weight of them became impossible to carry without acknowledging what they actually meant. But there were specific nights when the accumulation compressed into a single visible moment, and one of those nights arrived during the 2024 playoff run, when the Indiana Fever, a franchise that had not seen postseason basketball since 2016, walked into an away arena and performed with a collective precision that suggested something larger than a single good game was happening. Clark that night was not at her statistical peak. The assist numbers were modest by her standards, and the shooting chart told the story of a defense that had prepared specifically and intelligently for everything she preferred to do. What she did instead was locate every adjustment the defense had made and find the space those adjustments had created for her teammates, moving the ball into positions that forced the opposing coaching staff to choose between the problem they had prepared for and the problem they had not. That capacity to read a defensive scheme, identify its internal logic, and then attack precisely the assumption underneath that logic, rather than the surface of it, is what separated her game from the highlight version the casual viewer had come to watch. What that playoff run documented in real time was the gap between what Clark's presence meant statistically and what it meant structurally to every other player sharing the court with her. Indiana's supporting cast, playing inside a system that Clark's gravity had fundamentally reorganized, was operating with a freedom that the same players had not possessed the previous season. Defenders could not ignore Clark from anywhere on the floor, which meant that every screen set for a Fever cutter, every baseline drive by a teammate, every corner, three attempted by a player who might otherwise have been left to operate in semi-contested space, all of it became cleaner, more available, more executable, because one player's presence had rearranged the defensive mathematics of every possession. The Fever did not win that playoff series, but what they demonstrated across those games was a competitive architecture that had not existed in Indianapolis in nearly a decade, and the foundation of that architecture was a rookie point guard who had spent her first professional season absorbing contact, absorbing criticism, absorbing the full weight of an institution's adjustment to her arrival, and responding to all of it by becoming more precise, more composed, and more analytically dangerous than she had been the game before. The data from that run didn't just tell a story about one player. It told a story about what a league looks like when it finally has something it has never quite had before. The 337 assists, The 122 three-pointers. The 62 records broken across a single rookie season. The numbers are real, and they are significant, and they will sit inside the WNBA's official history for as long as the league exists. But the thing Caitlin Clark did that no statistical category was designed to measure was change the way an entire generation of people related to women's professional basketball, not by convincing them it deserved their attention through argument or advocacy, but by simply being so compelling on the court that the attention arrived before anyone had finished deciding whether to give it. Fans from Newfoundland driving to Indianapolis. Arenas and cities, Clark wasn't even playing for selling out, specifically because she was on the visiting roster. Broadcast partners calling with numbers that made previous rights deals look like they had been negotiated in a different sport entirely. None of that shows up in a box score. None of it gets captured in the efficiency metrics that front offices use to evaluate player value. It exists in a category that professional sports organizations rarely know how to account for until it arrives and reorganizes every assumption they had been operating under. Clark didn't just perform inside the WNBA's existing structure. She expanded the structure itself, stretched its boundaries outward in every commercial and cultural direction simultaneously, and did it during a period when the league's governance was still calibrated for the smaller version of itself that had existed the season before she arrived. What that kind of impact requires from the person carrying it is something that statistics genuinely cannot contain, a psychological resilience that goes beyond toughness and into something closer to clarity of purpose. Clark absorbed 2 seasons of physical contact that went unprotected by the officiating system. She absorbed public narratives that tried to frame her impact as divisive rather than unifying, that reached for controversy where the actual story was simply one of extraordinary growth. She absorbed the institutional ambivalence of a league that was collecting the financial benefits of her presence while simultaneously hedging its public acknowledgement of how central she was to those benefits. And through all of it, she kept her attention on the only thing she had ever been able to directly control: what happened between the lines, on the court, in the possessions that actually determined outcomes. That discipline, the refusal to let any external noise redirect energy that belonged to the game, is the quality that separates players who change their sport for a season from players who change it permanently. Legacy in professional sports is not built in the moments everyone is watching. It is built in the moments when the pressure to look away from what matters is at its highest, and the player looks straight ahead anyway. The collective bargaining agreement signed ahead of the 2025 season is, at its most fundamental level, a legal document. It contains salary figures and roster sizes and revenue-sharing percentages and season-length provisions and expansion franchise term. But legal documents are also historical documents, and what this one records in binding, enforceable, contractually obligated terms is the precise moment when the WNBA's financial reality caught up with what 2 seasons of Caitlin Clark had actually produced. Gross revenue sharing beginning in 2026. Higher minimum salaries across every tier. 3 new expansion franchises, including the Golden State Valkyries, each paying real entry fees into a league that was worth dramatically more than it had been when Clark walked into her first professional practice. A longer season, expanded rosters, and written into the agreement with the same legal weight as every financial provision, 3 formal review sessions per season between the league and the players' union, specifically to examine flagrant and technical foul decisions, plus union access to the same points of emphasis videos that referees receive before every season. That last provision is the one that tends to get discussed least and matters most, because it closes the information gap that allowed officiating problems to persist without accountability for 2 full seasons. When the union sees the same instructional materials the referees see, and when formal review sessions create a documented record of how officials perform against those standards, the black box that protected inconsistent officiating from consequence simply ceases to exist. What comes next for Clark, for the Fever, and for the league she restructured is an unfinished story operating inside a framework that is now, for the first time, genuinely built to support what she represents. The 2026 season is the first in which the full weight of the new agreement applies the salaries, the protections, the accountability structures, the expanded competitive landscape that 3 new franchises bring to a league that was running 12 teams when Clark arrived as a rookie. She will play that season And every season that follows, inside a system that her first 2 years of professional basketball helped force into existence. The players who come after her, the next generation of prospects deciding whether women's professional basketball in America is a viable destination for their careers and their ambitions, will enter a league whose financial floor, whose governance standards, and whose institutional relationship with its own stars have all been permanently reset. That reset did not happen because of a single speech, or a single game, or a single negotiating session. It happened because one player showed up every night,
along the way.
filled every building,
Numbers,
broke
meetings, and
every
money all
record
point
the
in the
league
same
had,
direction.
and made the numbers say something so clearly and so repeatedly that eventually there was nothing left to do but write it all down and sign it. The document exists. The structure holds. What the numbers said is now the law.